Good morning, class. This is going to be your notes for Monday, October 7th. Picking up from where we left off of the day with different communal societies. So we're looking at different examples of communal societies that develop kind of in reaction to all the materialism and all the different, industrialization and so forth. We talked about Brook Farm, which was a secular example, meaning non-religious, and we briefly got into the Shakers. Shakers, we said, were religious-based. They were a group of extreme Christians who had several of these communal experiment communities. Only about 6,000 people participated. They held property in common there at these Shaker locations, but they did keep the men and women separate. They forbid marriage and sexual relations. And so this is a communal experiment that didn't last long and eventually died out from lack of recruits. So which we covered all that last week on Thursday. So we're picking up on the new one with New Harmony. New Harmony was one location, a secular experiment in Indiana. So New Harmony was a secular experiment in Indiana. It was developed by an industrialist named Robert Owen. So Robert Owen comes over here from England. He was actually from Great Britain, and he develops this society. He hoped that the community would provide an answer to the problems of inequality and alienation of the Industrial Revolution. So he hoped that the community would provide an answer to problems of inequality and alienation of the Industrial Revolution. It failed because of financial problems and disagreements among members. So it failed because of financial problems and disagreements among members. So it didn't last that long in general, but it's another example of trying to make some kind of society that's better than what you have with just general industrial revolution. By the way, with these videos, please feel free to tell the substitute to stop and pause, rewind. They're not going to last the entire hour, so do whatever you need to do to get the notes taken care of. Okay, so that's New Harmony. Then you have the Oneida community, and that's on the screen there, Oneida community. This was a religious one, developed by John Humphrey Noyer. You don't have to know that name, but John Humphrey Noyer in 1848 developed this one in New York. He was dedicated to the idea of a perfect society. So this is an attempt at like a utopian community. So he was dedicated to the idea of a utopian society and also provide economic equality as well too. Like the Shakers, they also shared property, so it's a little bit of communism here, or hippie kind of lifestyle. And they also shared marriage partners too. So this group also would share marriage partners as well. It was kind of like also planning, a lot of planning of marriages and planning of pairings too in a lot of ways. Critics didn't like the planned reproduction system of the United Community and their communal child rearing. So like you also had basically the whole community raise children, not just your parents. The only reason they stayed around and remained successful for a long period of time is because of their selling of silverware. So they actually produced a lot of silverware there that a lot of people bought, and that's how they made a lot of their income in Oneida and New York. The last one is the Fourier Phalanxes. The Fourier Phalanxes is the last group. This developed from the idea of a French socialist, Charles Fourier. Fourier spelled F-O-U-R-I-E-R. So this developed from the idea of French socialist Charles Fourier. It advocated sharing work. So again, there's a sharing work again, that communal work living. And living spaces. So they also shared living spaces and work together. It died out pretty quickly in the 1840s. So it's another failed attempt at having that communal lifestyle. But in general, you're not going to have specific questions on tests about each of these. You just kind of want to, in general, know which is secular, which is religious-based, and know overall why these communities are forming in general. Okay, so we'll look very briefly at the art, architecture, and literature of this early 1800s period. So we know this new national culture emerges in the 1810s and 20s after the War of 1812. Now you have more Americans creating art, architecture, and literature that combines European ideas and themes with a lot of more regional, local ones here in America. So again, we're giving you art, architecture, and literature for like the first half of U.S. history in 1800s. One artist was John James Audubon, who you're probably familiar with. So John James Audubon, who actually painted a lot of these bird paintings just down the street at Oakley Plantation up near St. Francisville. He's one of the famous early American artists, painting these very lifelike, very realistic paintings of birds. So he's one of your early famous artists. Let's see. You also have painting everyday life was common in the 1830s. So in the 1830s, you see painting everyday life is very common. Things like riding riverboats, people voting, people doing domestic chores, those kind of things. One very famous art movement for the early 1800s was the Hudson River School. So one of the very famous art movements is the Hudson River School up north. It expressed Romanticism. Romanticism is basically the major art movement of the early 1800s. It's not Gothic. Gothic was also somewhat prominent in the 1840s. But Romanticism is essentially like these idealized versions of society or idealized versions of people. So the Hudson River School art movement expressed the Romanticism and fascination with the natural world. And I have some paintings here. There's two right here where they did a lot of landscapes. Thomas Cole and Frederick Church emphasized the heroic beauty of U.S. landscapes. So Thomas Cole and Frederick Church emphasized heroic beauty of U.S. landscapes. So Hudson River School emphasized a lot of natural beauty, natural landscapes. In architecture, the U.S. adopted a lot of Greek styles to glorify the democratic spirit. So, a good example of that is Washington, D.C. Washington, D.C. comes out early 1800s. A lot of its aesthetic in architecture is very Greco-Roman because they wanted to emphasize the democratic nature of America. So column facades graced many public entryways, as you see like in Washington, D.C. and many other capital areas of the country. So that's some of your basic art and architecture you'd be aware of in this time period. Next, you have literature. In addition to Transcendentalism, which is only a somewhat minor movement in the 1840s and 50s, other writers made distinct American literature beginning in the early 1800s, partially because of the nationalism growing after World War of 1812. So because of the nationalism growing after the War of 1812, you do see more of a unique American literature style. You finally begin to start to see fiction as well too. Romanticism is the big movement of literature from the early 1800s until about the 1850s. That's the most dominant literature movement. So here are a couple authors. First, you have James Fenimore Cooper. James Fenimore Cooper, who wrote a series of books called The Leatherstocking Tales. So James Fenimore Cooper wrote a series of books called The Leatherstocking Tales. He wrote from the 1820s and 1840s. Books included Last of the Mohicans, The Pathfinder, and The Deerslayer. So his books included The Last of the Mohicans, The Pathfinder, and The Deerslayer. A lot of his books glorify the frontiersman, kind of as nature's nobleman. So a lot of his books focus on expansion and the frontier in general. And you see that kind of really envelop the American spirit early on. Then you have Washington Irving. Washington Irving writes he's like the first American fiction writer who writes very early on in American history. He writes Legend of Sleepy Hollow and Rip Van Winkle. Legend of Sleepy Hollow, of course, is the Ichabod Crane, Headless Horseman story. Rip Van Winkle is a story about a man who tries to avoid work and tries to avoid his wife and goes to sleep. After this, he encounters these people in the mountains of New York and wakes up 20 years later. And it's kind of commentary about America before and after the Revolutionary War, because he basically sleeps the whole through it. So it has this magical element to it. But anyway, so it was a lot of the two book stories was like establishment versus new themes, like the new people versus old people, and establishment versus new folks, and so on. Nathaniel Hawthorne was also a very early American romantic writer who was popular, who wrote The Scarlet Letter, many other short stories. I myself I'm not a big fan of The Scarlet Letter, but there's a lot of short stories I much prefer from Hawthorne you should check out. Herman Melville also wrote his famous book Moby Dick about this crew of sailors looking for this white whale. It reflected a lot of theological and cultural conflicts of the era. So Herman Melville's Moby Dick, which comes out in the 1850s, reflected theological and cultural conflicts of the era as well. Okay, so, and I have a slide here, shows you some of these titles. You can see here's Washington Irving there, and you see The Scarlet Letter with Hawthorne here. James Fenimore Cooper with the Leatherstocking Tales, and then you see Moby Dick with Herman Melville. It's the last one that should go off. Okay. Do a little bit more, then we're going to stop the video. All right, so now we're looking at the reform. Like we said, the Second Great Awakening causes a lot of the reform of this era. It inspires a lot of the reform of this era, so we're going to talk about that next. So, reform goes through several stages in the antebellum period. At first, a lot of people wanted to improve moral society and behavior through persuasion. So at first, in the 20s, 30s, early 40s, a lot of people who wanted to reform wanted to improve people's morals through persuasion, talking to them, trying to convince them. After trying sermons and pamphlets with persuasion, many began to move to politics and decide that only with laws and changes with politics, like in the 1850s, will things begin to change. And that pushes more towards things like abolition. So the first movement we're going to talk about is temperance. Temperance is referring to essentially tempering the drinking you do. A lot of folks believe that there was too high of an alcohol consumption rate in America, and that was leading to many of society's problems. So a lot of people's natural go-to idea was, if you remove alcohol from society, then you basically solve society's problems. So there was a high rate of alcohol consumption. 5 gallons of hard liquor per person in 1820 was the average, which is a lot. So a lot of folks thought that was the reason why you had a lot of social problems. It was a very popular reform, especially among ministers and women in the 20s and 30s, to try to get rid of alcohol. In 1826, Protestant ministers and others concerned with the effects of drinking founded a society called the American Temperance Society. So you have the American Temperance Society formed in 1826 as a way to try to combat against this behavior. They try to persuade people to take a pledge of total abstinence. So they try to persuade people to take a pledge of total abstinence. That was their go-to method. They wanted people, abstinence basically means you don't do it at all. If you don't do it at all, you can't be tempted by alcohol. So not even drinking in moderation. They were just like, don't drink at all. That was their goal. In 1840, Washingtonians was a new group that formed. So you have a separate group formed in 1840 called the Washingtonians. They began recovering. They were formed by recovering alcoholics. Anyway, they're one of the first groups to refer to alcoholism as a disease needing treatment. So the Washingtonians were formed by recovering alcoholics. They were one of the first groups to refer to alcoholism as a disease needing to be treated. Over 1 million people were involved in temperance groups or movements by the 1840s. So this was a very large movement. The middle class very much embraced this. So this is a big middle class, especially women, embraced this movement. Many immigrants obviously opposed, because immigrants come from Europe that have much more lax drinking laws and ideas. And so by the 1850s, factory owners and politicians joined together for temperance, because it was also kind of a way to target immigrants too, because it reduced crime and poverty and increased worker output. So politicians and factory owners by the 50s began to join together to promote temperance because it helped reduce crime and poverty and increase work output. Maine becomes the first state to actually prohibit alcohol or do prohibition of alcohol among 12 states pre-Civil War. So that's something to also keep in mind too, that prohibition does not just start all of a sudden in the 1900s and just gets passed throughout the entire country. Several states begin to actually prohibit alcohol in the 1800s. 12 do so pre-Civil War because people begin to realize the ill effects that alcohol can bring. But temperance, like many other issues, began to get overshadowed by slavery and abolition in the 1850s. And you don't see temperance in the pro-prohibition debate come back up until the 1870s. So we're not going to see that become an issue again until later on, 1870s. All right, next you have public asylums. Increasing numbers of criminals, emotionally disturbed persons, and paupers developed by the 1830s. So there's more people in society means you have more people who have emotional disturbances or emotional problems. So there's an increasing number of criminals, emotional disturbed people, and paupers. Pauper meaning people like in poverty by the 1830s. Also, people who just need like medical attention, medical treatments in general. They lived in terrible conditions and often were neglected. A lot of times, people who had mental illnesses or people who were poor were just thrown in jail. A lot of folks were just thrown in jail and not well taken care of in general. So reformers hoped to develop new public institutions, new locations to help treat these people in general. So they wanted to develop prisons for reforming criminals, mental hospitals, specifically made to help address people who had these mental illnesses, and also develop poorhouses. This would help cure a lot of their antisocial behavior with a lot of discipline setting. So the biggest name you need to be aware of in public asylums is Dorothea Dix. Dorothea Dix, who you see a picture of right here. Dorothea Dix was horrified to find mentally ill people locked up with criminals whenever she took these tours of prisons in New England. She dedicated her life to aiding mentally disabled and traveled to states to get public asylums developed. So she dedicated her life to trying to aid mentally disabled people and traveled to state governments trying to convince them to pass funding for public asylums. So like the first one she focuses on in Massachusetts, where she eventually convinces them to set aside public land. But that's kind of her goal, trying to travel to states, which she does so through the 1860s, trying to get states to provide funding for these public asylums. So if you ever see on a test Dorothea Dix, that's what you need to associate her with, is going to be public asylums, mental institutions. Other schools include like schools for the blind and deaf. So schools like we have one in Louisiana. Many states began developing schools for the blind and deaf to help have separate facilities for those people so they can go to school. And you also see prisons. Most states had just a jail, and the idea was you committed a crime and you just got thrown in jail. Many folks wanted to develop prisons as a way to rehabilitate yourself in general. So people began to experiment placing prisoners in prisons to try to force them to reflect on their sins and help them try to improve. Because the idea of prisons is that they're going to be rehabilitated, that you're going to try to do things, train them to be better citizens, train them with education, so that one day they can come out in society and be better contributors to society overall. Okay, so that's where we're going to stop this video.